My name is Christine Drennon. I'm the director of the Urban Studies program at Trinity University. San Antonio is really interesting. San Antonio is really special. It has a tragic history, just like a lot of cities do, with race and with class and with the environment. But there's also something really interesting that we have created. I love the city, and I am lucky enough to have a job that allows me to spend time exploring and studying the city. Shortly after moving here in 2002, the city was listed as one of the, and then the, most economically segregated city in the country. That resonated with the experience that I had had trying to buy a house. As an educator, when we say we work on something, it really is to study it and understand it. In this case, to historicize it, to find its roots. When did this start, and how do we keep perpetuating it? And it still continues, and it's getting worse. So I need to historicize it and understand it over time, not just its inception or its beginning. When the city was first developed, as somebody buys up a piece of land, some of these were actual land grants, but at some point they develop it. You subdivide it into little independent pieces of property. You may build on it or you may sell it as raw land. Up by Trinity, for example, when they subdivided that land, it was into pretty large lots. And then they insisted when houses were going to be built that they be large, and that only Caucasian, and that was the word that they used, only Caucasian families could live in them. On the west side was the same process. Somebody received land grants, somebody bought land on the west side. The railroads were going through there, but also the cattle drives came up from the southwestern part of the state through the west side. And we built the stockyards on the west side, and it made sense geographically because that's where the cattle are coming from. And they start to put in housing on the west side on very small lots. Really small lots with really humble housing. You did not build equity in that house. You didn't really have any form of ownership whatsoever until the entire thing was paid off. So you weren't free just to sell it, right, and make a profit off of it. And the housing on the west side, unlike in the other parts of town, was not racially restricted. So that's where the Mexican American and a lot of African American families ended up. The other parts of town weren't available to them. You know, the city's established along those guidelines. The neighborhoods are established. So we got really uneven development in these different parts of town where the original land grants were. We head into the Great Depression. And in order to get us out of the Great Depression, really New Deal legislation comes up with this whole era that we now know as redlining. And this was national legislation, and it was really signals to banks that we need to get the American economy rolling again. If we want to do that, we have to get our credit markets rolling. Well, one of the tools that was used by really the federal government, but it funnels all the way down to the states, past the states, but to the local level, was what we today know as the redlining maps. We're going to create a series of maps of every city in the country, and we're going to color code the existent neighborhoods. And if a neighborhood is got a really solid housing stock, and it's full, it's a complete neighborhood, there's no vacant property, and it's a homogeneously white or Anglo neighborhood, it's coded green or blue. And that was a signal to the banks that this was a risk-free area or part of town to lend money in. If a neighborhood had a deteriorating housing stock and/or a non-white presence, or even the threat of a non-white presence, then that neighborhood was coded yellow or red. A signal to the banks that this was a more higher risk part of town to lend in. So it made it much more difficult to buy or sell a house or to fix up your house, right? It also pushed a lot of families into what we would today call a predatory lending environment. The west side of San Antonio was redlined. It was a housing stock that was deteriorated. It was built very humbly when it was first built. It was non-white. It fits all the categories of redlining. The other area of town that was redlined was Dignity Hill. Now, Dignity Hill today, for those of us here in San Antonio, know it's our most rapidly gentrifying area. Housing prices have gone up by like 300% in the last couple of years. It is an extremely valuable part of town, and when it was built, it was quite elite, and the houses are fantastic. They're beautiful, and they were well built at the time. But it was redlined, but what it looks like is that there was an African-American presence, right? There was an African-American presence up along the railroads and on those alleys, right? The little houses on the alleys and then on the outskirts of the neighborhood were black. That's probably why most of the east side was also redlined, although it was elite at the time. In the intervening years, it deteriorates. Houses are subdivided, they're passed into rentals, they're not kept up, right? For a lot of people who are trying to understand American urban neighborhoods, the story stops there. The story shouldn't stop there.
The truly dynamic American cities are those that are coming to grips with the problem of outmoded structures. Increasingly, we are seeing large-scale demolition as the first step in building modern cities. And our progress is certain to be steady as we clear away the structures that block progress.
The federal government passes urban renewal policies and says, if you cities can really distinguish parts of your area as blighted, that you need new funds and new financing to come in from the federal government to help you rebuild your inner cities, we will do that. And this was policy. They weren't consistent in the use of terms like blight. So in some cities, blight meant really seriously deteriorated. In some cities, blight meant non-white. In some cities, blight meant inconvenient. We'd really like something else there. So the policy was implemented really, really poorly. But it was federal money that was coming down from the federal government, public money down to the local level to really try to reinvest and rebuild our cities. In San Antonio, it's at that point that a lot of the west side neighborhoods are condemned. They were condemned. We used the tools of eminent domain that had been given to cities and to housing authorities by the federal government in order to buy that land from people. It wasn't worth that much because the housing, like I'd said before, was humble. So they never got enough money to really rehouse themselves adequately. We still live with that problem. It's under those old neighborhoods, those west side neighborhoods that we built UTSA, the jail system, the criminal justice system, parts of the Brady Green Hospital, right? The highway went in right there, I-10, cut south through that entire area. Those were all neighborhoods, right? And they were thriving Mexican-American, actually quite diverse neighborhoods. They were also African-American, Italian-Americans. You can see that in the old census. Businesses, theaters, retail, really active. And we condemned it. And so that continues to reverberate also. And through all of that, families continue to move, money's available in different areas and in different forms. And also the idea of housing itself is changing. Housing at one point was a place to raise a family. The value of your house came from its use. How big was it? How many bedrooms did it have, right? How many kids can I raise in that house, all right? We begin to change the rules of wealth accumulation. Our house becomes our place to grow our wealth and our family's wealth. More recently, housing has changed again. And housing has now become a way of really accumulating profit through speculation. We buy houses. We fix them up, or we pretend to fix them up. We never even live there, or we live there for a couple of years, never really sinking our value into it, and we flip it at a highly inflated price, right? And the markets are allowing to do that. More recently, now, housing is speculative, right? Housing is investment. And that's a tremendous shift. And it's this era that we're in right now that we are very much a part of. Whenever we think about where to live, we don't just think about it as a use value. We think about it as, well, if I want to move in 5 years, what's this thing going to be worth? We're part of this. And so we fail to talk about what we do today. And until we start those conversations, we're not going to change anything. We're not going to change anything. We need to have the current conversations rather than continuing to absolve ourselves of anything that happened in the past.